The fog came in off the Thames before dawn, the kind that pressed against windows and swallowed street lamps whole, so that by the time Eleanor Ashford arrived at Harwick House, the torches at the gate had become mere suggestions of light, and the stone facade rose from the gray like something half-imagined. She carried a leather satchel against her hip, her boot heels precise on the cobblestones, and she did not look up at the carved crest above the door. She had stopped looking at it approximately 4 years ago, when she had learned that crests were decorative and ledgers were real. And at the edge of all that fog-swallowed grandeur, arriving alone, unremarkable in her gray wool, her satchel already open and her morning list already in hand, was Eleanor Ashford. The house was preparing for the Wentworth reception, the largest gathering the Harwick estate had hosted in 11 years. Florists had arrived at 5 in the morning with crates of hothouse lilies. The silver had been polished twice. Mrs. Gareth, the housekeeper, had reorganized the entire east corridor twice more, and both times the footmen had moved everything back because the caterer's men required the space. Eleanor had arrived at 5:30, before any of them, and had already identified that the floral arrangement in the entrance hall was positioned directly beneath the draught from the upper gallery and would be wilted by 8 o'clock. She moved the arrangement herself, 14 inches to the left, without informing anyone. In the ballroom, she checked the seating arrangement against her written plan, found that 3 placard cards had been transposed, the sort of error that would produce a public slight between the Ashton family and Lord Mercer, who had not spoken civilly since the enclosure dispute of 1819, and corrected them with a pencil from her satchel. The candles in the eastern chandeliers had been placed irregularly, which would produce uneven light for the musicians. She spoke to the footman at the door, gave him the specific correction, and moved on. The musicians were already tuning in the upper gallery. Below, the ballroom was empty except for Eleanor and the long work of making something this complicated appear effortless. This was the nature of her labor. The more successfully she performed it, the less anyone would ever think to ask who had done it. She had understood this for a long time. It did not make her resentful anymore. It made her precise. She was consulting the list a 3rd time. There was a discrepancy in the wine order, 30 bottles of claret short of what the caterer had confirmed in writing, when the outer doors opened, and Rhys Dunmore, Duke of Harwick, came in from the fog. He did not come through the servants' entrance, which would have been the practical choice at this hour. He came through the main door, as he always had, as though Harwick House were a country he ruled without needing maps. He wore a dark greatcoat, road-dusted, and he had not slept. Eleanor knew this because she had managed this household for 4 years, and she knew the precise lines of his face at every hour. And the lines at present were different from exhaustion in the ordinary way. They were the lines of a man who had spent a long journey making a decision and had arrived somewhere he was not certain he was prepared to be. He stopped when he saw her. He did not say good morning. He said, "Miss Ashford," the way a man names a fact he has been thinking about for a long time. She said, "Your Grace, you are 3 hours ahead of your expected arrival. The house is not yet prepared to receive guests." He looked at her for a moment with the measuring attention of someone who has just identified something they cannot quite account for. Then he said, "I did not come for the guests." Eleanor pressed one hand briefly against the page of her list and continued. She had managed the Harwick household from the winter of 1817, when Lord Aldrich Dunmore, Rhys's father and the previous Duke of Harwick, had called her into the estate office and placed before her a set of accounts in such disorder that the steward who had produced them had needed to be quietly replaced within the fortnight. Eleanor had been 23 at the time, recently arrived at Harwick as a distant relation of the Dunmores through a connection so remote that no one had ever bothered to define it clearly, which meant she had no formal standing, no salary, and no particular right to refuse. She had looked at the accounts for approximately 40 minutes and told Lord Aldrich the precise nature of the problem. He had stared at her. He had then said, "How do you know this?" And she had told him that her father had been a wool merchant who could not keep his own books, and that she had been keeping them for him since she was 15, and that the accounts before her showed the same pattern she had seen in her father's ledgers the year before he died. A steward who had learned that a distracted principal was an opportunity. Lord Aldrich had said nothing. He had handed her the estate seal. She had not had a formal title in 4 years. She had not had a salary for the first 18 months. Only a room and her meals, and Lord Aldrich's vague understanding that she was useful. By the time she had negotiated her first annual payment, £75, which she had argued up from 40 with a written document showing the value of the creditor negotiations she had personally managed, she had already restructured the estate accounts, renegotiated the primary wool contract at a margin improvement of £400 annually, and prevented a legal action from the Harwick tenants by identifying an error in the enclosure records that had been copied incorrectly for 30 years. None of this appeared in any official record. The documents bore the late Lord Aldrich's seal and, later, Rees's. Eleanor's name appeared nowhere except on her own annotated copies, which she kept in a locked box at the back of her wardrobe. She had not been angry about this. She had been 23, and then 24, and then 25, and the work was real and she was capable of doing it, and the alternative, returning to her mother's house in Bristol with no income and no prospects, was not something she was willing to accept. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and Eleanor had understood very early that she was either going to be that person, or she was going to find a different room, and she had not yet found the different room. There had been one moment, 18 months into her invisible tenure, when a creditor named Hobson had arrived at Harwick and demanded to see the estate manager. He had been brought to Eleanor. He had looked at her for a long moment and said, "I was told the manager," and Eleanor had said, "Yes." "Please sit down, Mr. Hobson." She had then produced the annotated contract, the payment record, and the specific clause he was attempting to invoke incorrectly, and she had explained, in a voice of complete evenness, precisely why his demand had no legal standing. Hobson had sat down. He had left without the payment he had come for. At the door he had paused and said, with something close to genuine respect, "You're wasted here, miss." Eleanor had picked up her list and continued. She had not been going to become less than she was. This was not courage exactly. It was a decision she had made at some point and did not revisit. The moment she had come closest to breaking was the letter. It had arrived in the spring of 1820, addressed to Lord Aldrich in a hand she did not recognize, and she had opened it in the routine way of estate correspondence, and it had been from Rees, then 25, traveling the continent on what the family called an educational tour, and she privately understood to be the prolonged absence of a man who did not wish to inherit anything. The letter described Venice in December, the light off the canals, the cold that came in under doors, and at the end, almost as afterthought, a single sentence, "I think about Harwick sometimes. Tell me if it is still standing." She had resealed the letter and placed it with the others and had not thought about it for 3 days. Then she had gone back to the morning room, opened her own ledger, and written at the top of a new page, "The house is still standing. I am keeping it standing." And then she had closed the ledger and gone back to work, because there was no one to write to, and the accounting did not do itself, and she was not, in any case, going to sentimentalize a sentence in a letter that was not addressed to her. This was the year the elder Lord Aldrich had died. Rees had come home from the continent in September, arriving in the same manner he had arrived this morning, unexpectedly, through the front door, at an hour no one was prepared for. He had found the household ordered, the accounts current, the creditors paid, and a woman he barely remembered at a writing table in the estate office with the estate seal beside her hand. He had said, "Miss Ashford." She had said, "Your Grace, I have prepared a full account of the estate's position. When you are ready to review it, I am available." He had looked at her for a moment in a way she could not entirely read, and then he had said, "Give me an hour," and she had given him the hour, and he had never asked her to leave. For the next 2 years, she had managed the Harwick estate under Reese's nominal authority and her own practical direction. He traveled less. He appeared in the estate office at irregular hours and asked questions that were occasionally good and occasionally reflected that he had not yet finished understanding what he had inherited. Eleanor answered every question with the same completeness she had given his father, without impatience, because she understood that competence was not diminished by being shared, and because, though she had not admitted this in any ledger, she had come to find the hours when Reese was in the estate office and she was working through the quarterly accounts to be the best hours of her day. He never said thank you in any way that felt like it cost him something. She had not expected him to. And then in the spring of 1821, Lady Cecilia Vane had arrived at Harwick for the first of 3 extended visits, and everything that had been accumulating in Eleanor Ashford had quietly begun its long reorganization. Reese Dunmore had received the investigator's report on the 2nd of March, 1821, and he had read it 3 times. He had not commissioned the report about Eleanor. He had commissioned it about Hobson, the creditor who had been causing a low-grade irritation in his estate correspondence for several months, and Hobson had been dispatched by the report in a single page. But the remaining 4 pages he had not asked for, which the investigator had included under the heading of material pertinent to the estate's operational continuity, had detailed, with numerical precision, the nature and extent of what Eleanor Ashford had done for Harwick over the previous 4 years. The numbers were not abstractions, they were specific. £400 in annual recovered margin from the renegotiated wool contract. 3 legal actions averted, 2 of them with documented errors in original conveyances that only someone with detailed knowledge of the estate records could have found. 37 creditor agreements renegotiated over 4 years, 29 of them improved in Harwick's favor. Total estimated value to the estate, conservative estimate, £1,200 annually, compounding from 1817. He sat with this report for a long time. He had known Eleanor was capable. He had not known, not in this specific, documented way, the scale of what she had been doing with no title, no formal authority, and for the first 18 months, no salary at all. He had walked to the estate office that afternoon and found her at the writing table with the quarterly wool accounts open before her, her pen moving with the even strokes of someone who had been doing this for so long the motion was as natural as breathing. He had stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. She had not startled. She had simply looked up, noted his presence, and waited. He had said, "I reviewed Hobson's file." She had said, "Yes, I thought you would find it useful." He had not told her about the 4 additional pages. He had said, "The estate is in considerably better condition than it was when my father died." She had said, "Yes, I have the comparative accounts if you would like to review them." He had stood there for a moment looking at her in the afternoon light, a woman he had taken entirely for granted in the way that one takes for granted a working mechanism, never asking how it works, only noticing if it stops, and he had felt something then that he did not have an adequate name for. It was not guilt, quite. It was the specific discomfort of a man who has just understood that someone else has been carrying a significant portion of his life, and he has been acting as though it were simply the way things were. He had said nothing useful. He had thanked her, in the inadequate way he had been thanking her for 2 years, and gone back to his study. But he had begun to stand outside the estate office in the evenings, not entering, not announcing himself, simply existing in the corridor near the line of light under the door. He had done this for 6 nights before he understood why. She worked until 10 o'clock most evenings. The house was quiet at that hour, and the sound of her pen moving, the occasional turn of a page, the single quiet note she would sometimes hum when she found an error and corrected it. These sounds had become, without his permission, the sound of the house being all right. On the 7th night he had knocked. She had opened the door with ink on her fingers and a candle in her other hand, and she had looked at him without surprise, because Eleanor Ashford was not easily surprised, and she had said, "Your Grace, is there something you need?" He had said, "I brought the Wentworth correspondence. There are 3 matters you should review before the reception." She had looked at him for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who is deciding whether to name the thing in the room, and then she had stepped back and let him in. He had not left until midnight. They had worked through the Wentworth correspondence side by side at the writing table, and at some point, for she had moved her candle to give him better light, and at some point he had stopped pretending that the correspondence was the reason he had knocked. This was the version of Rhys Dunmore that no one at the reception would see. The man who knocked on a door at 9:30 at night, not because he needed an estate review, but because the estate office was the room where someone was doing real work, and he had learned, too late and too slowly, that real work was the thing he most understood how to be near. He did not say any of this. He arranged the Wentworth reception instead, and he invited Lady Cecilia Vane, because that was what dukes did, and he told himself the decisions about the estate and the decisions about his private life were separate matters, which was the most efficient lie he had told in some time. The Wentworth reception arrived with all the apparatus that large social events required: coaches in the drive, ladies in white and gold, the formal progression through the east entrance, and the ballroom lit from above so that the chandeliers produced exactly the even distribution Eleanor had specified when she corrected the footman's placement of the candles 6 hours earlier. Eleanor herself was not in the ballroom. She was in the small room adjacent to the east corridor, where the catering accounts were spread across a table, and the claret shortfall had become, on closer examination, a deliberate substitution of a lesser vintage at the same billed price. She had written the discrepancy in her notebook and set it aside for the post-reception reckoning, and she was reviewing the flower account when Margaret Soane found her. Margaret had arrived at Harwick 6 weeks earlier as a guest of the Wentworth party, a connection of Mrs. Wentworth's, who had been described to Eleanor in the household introduction notes as spirited and somewhat unfiltered. She was 27, brown-haired, and she had spent approximately 4 minutes in Eleanor's company before announcing that Eleanor was the most competent person in the house and that she intended to form a friendship whether or not Eleanor was agreeable to it. Eleanor had been, cautiously, agreeable. "You are hiding again," Margaret said now, leaning in the doorway with a glass of champagne she had not drunk. "I am managing the catering accounts," Eleanor said. "The claret is wrong. Someone made a substitution. The claret is perfectly acceptable. Come to the ballroom." "I am not a guest." Margaret looked at her with the particular expression of a person who has decided to be indignant on someone else's behalf. "You organized this entire event. You moved the flowers, corrected the seating, fixed the candles, and prevented the Ashton Mercer incident. You are the reason tonight functions. You should be allowed to stand in the room you made work." "That is not how it works," Eleanor said, without heat. "I know it isn't. That is precisely my complaint." Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then set down her pen and closed the notebook. It was a small concession. She was not going to explain, to Margaret or anyone, the particular calculus of being useful without being visible. The way she had learned to inhabit the edges of things, because the edges were where the work actually was, and the work was the thing she could be sure of. 30 minutes, she said. Then I need to return to the accounts. The ballroom was everything it was supposed to be. 300 people arranged in the precise configuration that Eleanor's seating chart had produced. The music carrying from the upper gallery at exactly the right volume, the east chandeliers casting the even warm light she had specified. She stood at the edge of the room near the east entrance and watched it functioning and felt something between satisfaction and the specific loneliness of making beautiful things no one knows are yours. Lady Cecilia Vane was visible from any position in the room. She was the kind of woman who had been assembled by her world for exactly this purpose. Tall, golden-haired, credentialed by birth, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who had never wondered whether she had the right to occupy a space. She was not unkind, precisely. She was simply so thoroughly certain of her own position that she produced a kind of atmospheric pressure, and most people in her vicinity simply adjusted their orientation accordingly. She found Eleanor at the east entrance within 10 minutes. "Miss Ashford," she said, "how curious. I thought you would be busy with arrangements." "The arrangements are complete," Eleanor said. "Indeed. I noticed someone moved the flowers in the entrance hall. The original placement was charming. It is a pity someone felt the need to improve on it." She smiled, the kind of smile that meant something other than warmth. "Still, I suppose those of us without artistic sensibility must manage as we can." Eleanor looked at her with complete evenness. "The original placement was directly beneath the upper gallery draft. The arrangement would have been wilted before the first guests arrived. It is now performing well." She paused. "Precisely. I moved it." Cecilia's smile adjusted fractionally. "Of course you did." She moved away with the smoothness of a woman who has never needed to stay anywhere she was not winning, and Eleanor pressed one hand briefly against the wall, once, and then straightened her spine and turned to watch the room. Reese was across the ballroom. He was speaking with Lord Wentworth and two men Eleanor recognized from the estate's primary investor circle, and he was not looking at her, and then he was. He caught her eye across the width of the room with an expression she had been trying to read for 2 years and had not quite managed. The expression of a man who has identified something he cannot account for, and Eleanor looked back at him for the length of one measured breath, and then she returned to the east corridor and her accounts. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. Charles Worthing, the senior estate advisor who had managed the Harwick legal affairs for nearly 30 years, found Eleanor the following morning in the estate office. He was 71, precise without being cold, and he had known about Eleanor's operational role in the estate for 2 years, long enough to form opinions he never made public and occasionally acted upon. "The Wentworth investors," he said, sitting down without invitation, which was how he always sat. "There is something you should know. The Harwick estate's primary expansion, the northern property development Reese had been negotiating for 18 months, had attracted a consortium of 4 investors, the Wentworth Group among them. The proposal was to develop 600 acres of northern land for mixed use, wool production, tenant farming, and a managed timber operation that Eleanor had argued would recover its capital outlay within 7 years. She had done the calculations herself. The projections were sound. What Charles Worthing told her that morning was that 2 members of the consortium, Alderman Fletcher and a man named Southcott, who Eleanor had never met, but whose name appeared in the estate correspondence with increasing frequency, had been, for the past 3 months, presenting a competing proposal to the same northern acreage to a separate body of investors, using projection figures that bore a notable resemblance to Eleanor's own work. "They have your numbers," Charles said. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. "Exactly my numbers or figures that arrived at the same conclusions. Specific figures, the 7-year recovery timeline, the wool margin calculation, the tenant yield projections." "Those projections are in the estate planning file," Eleanor said, "which is held in this office." "Yes." She pressed her lips together, once, and looked at the locked box at the back of the room. the box that held her annotated copies, the one with her name on the calculations. They would have needed to copy them before March. The final projection figures were not complete until February. She was already thinking backward through the calendar. There was a week in February when I was in Bristol for my mother's illness. The office was not locked. Charles looked at her with the expression of a man who has confirmed what he came to confirm. I thought you should know before the consortium meeting. When is the consortium meeting? 4 days. Eleanor picked up her pen. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Worthing," and opened her ledger, and Charles Worthing stood, straightened his coat, and left, because he had learned 2 years ago that when Eleanor Ashford opened her ledger, after being given information, she was working, and working Eleanor required no audience. She had 4 days. She spent the first of them reconstructing the sequence of the planning documents, identifying which figures appeared in which version of the proposal, and annotating each set of calculations with the specific date and source she could verify. The documents she had produced were traceable. She had a habit of small marginal notes, corrections, and procedural references that were hers and not anyone else's, the characteristic markers of a person who had been working alone for years and had therefore developed the habit of explaining her reasoning to herself on the page. By the end of the first day, she had a clear sequence. The consortium's competing proposal drew directly from her February projections, including 2 errors she had made in early drafts and later corrected, which appeared in Southcott's version uncorrected. This was evidence of the specific moment of copying. On the second day, Reese came to the estate office. He did not knock this time. He came in from the corridor and stopped when he saw the documents arranged across the table in Eleanor's systematic order, and she looked up and said, simply, "Southcott and Fletcher." He said, "You know, Mr. Worthing told me. Sit down, Your Grace." He sat down across from her, and she walked him through it. The February projections, the copied figures, the 2 uncorrected errors that appeared in the competing proposal. The timeline that established the copying had happened during her absence. She spoke in the measured, organized way she brought to everything, pointing to specific pages, specific figures, specific dates. She did not editorialize. She did not express indignation. She simply presented what the documents showed. When she was finished, Reese sat looking at the arranged papers for a moment. He said, "This is your work." "Yes. All of the expansion projections, the timber recovery timeline, the tenant yield calculations." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him with the attention she brought to things she needed to understand, and she saw something in the set of his face that was not quite the expression of a duke being told about an investor conspiracy. It was something older than that. He said, "How long have you been producing work like this and putting no name to it?" Eleanor said, 4 years. The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "I have not been looking at this correctly," he said finally. She said, "You have been looking at it correctly for some time now, Your Grace. You have simply been slow to do anything about it. There was no accusation in this. It was merely a statement of the account as it stood." He looked at her then with the expression she had been unable to read for 2 years, and she understood, finally, that it was not complexity that had made it unreadable. It was familiarity. It was the expression of someone looking at something that has become so necessary to them that they have stopped seeing it as separate from themselves, and are only now, with difficulty, relearning to look. He said, "What do you need for the consortium meeting?" She told him. He wrote it down. That evening he came to the estate office at 9:30, as he had begun to do on the evenings when the house was quiet, and he worked with her through the annotated documents until nearly 11. At some point she reached past him for a specific page, and he remained quite still, in the way he had of containing himself completely, and she was close enough to see that his cravat had been knotted imprecisely, slightly off-center, the kind of thing that occurred when a man had been working through the day and adjusting his collar without a glass. She straightened it. Her fingers were at his collar for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she returned to the document she had reached for, and Rhys Dunmore said nothing at all, and the room was completely quiet. She had straightened his cravat. She could not entirely explain why. It was the kind of thing one did with something that had been incorrect for too long, and she had known it was incorrect for, she calculated, approximately 40 minutes before she did anything about it. She did not look at him again until they had finished the documents. When she looked up, he was watching her with the specific stillness of a man who has made a decision and is not yet ready to name it. He said, "Eleanor." She had never heard him use her given name before. It sounded, in his voice, like something precise. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had said, only to the sound of her name in that register, and she pressed one hand against the table, once, and then stood and began organizing the documents for the morning. He stood too. He said, "The consortium meeting is in 2 days. After it is finished," he paused in the way he paused when he was being careful, "I would like to speak with you." "Yes," she said again, which remained technically not an answer to anything. On the day before the consortium meeting, Lord Harwick's father arrived. This was not entirely unexpected. Edwin Dunmore, the former Duke's brother and the senior Dunmore by age if not by title, had been a presence at the edges of the estate's affairs for several years, a man who held opinions about Harwick with the conviction of someone who had managed to develop strong views about a property he did not own and had never operated. He was 64, correctness made flesh, and he had formed his opinion of Eleanor Ashford within approximately 11 minutes of learning she existed. He found her in the morning room, which was itself a kind of territorial claim. The morning room was not the estate office, and Edwin Dunmore had apparently decided that Eleanor in a more social room was Eleanor he could address in social terms. He said, without preliminary, "I have been reviewing the northern expansion proposal." "Yes," Eleanor said. She did not put down her work. "The investment consortium has 2 members presenting an alternative proposal. I have reviewed both." "Yes. I find I cannot determine which set of projections originated with Harwick and which originated elsewhere. Both appear to draw from the same source material." Eleanor looked up at him. "The Harwick projections originated here, sir. The dates on the planning documents are verifiable. If there is any confusion about origins, I can show you the working documents." Edwin Dunmore looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided that what he is about to say is a kindness, which is the most dangerous expression a person can wear. "Miss Ashford, you are clearly capable." "No one disputes that, but you must understand that what you are proposing, your presence at this consortium meeting, presenting this material, is not appropriate. The families involved in this investment have expectations about who represents Harwick." "I am not proposing to attend," Eleanor said. "I am proposing that the documents I produced attend. The Duke will present them. These investors know one another. The question of where these projections originated will be asked, and when it is asked, the answer, a household dependent with no title, will not satisfy them." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She set her pen down with complete deliberateness. She said, "I have managed the Harwick estate accounts for 4 years, sir. I have recovered £1,200 annually on a conservative measure. I have renegotiated 29 of 37 creditor agreements, prevented 3 legal actions, and produced the northern expansion projections that 2 members of this consortium have found credible enough to copy directly. The documents will demonstrate all of this. The question of whether that is satisfying to investors is a separate matter from whether it is true." She picked up her pen and continued. Edwin Dunmore stood for a moment in the particular stillness of a man who has been answered more precisely than he expected. He left without further comment. She had managed harder conversations than this before breakfast. She could manage this. The consortium meeting was held in the Harwick Library in the late afternoon of the third day, and it was attended by 6 men, the 4 consortium investors, the estate solicitor Charles Worthing, and Reese. Eleanor was not in the room. She was in the estate office adjacent, the communicating door slightly open, which was how the meeting had been arranged at Charles Worthing's quiet suggestion, a compromise she had accepted without protest, because she understood the machinery of her situation with complete clarity, and the machinery at present required that the documents speak before she did. She had prepared a full annotated set, 41 pages, organized in 4 sections: the origin and development timeline of the northern projections, with specific dated marginal notations in her own hand, the 2 draft stage errors that appeared in Southcott's version and their corrected counterparts in hers, a financial comparison of the competing proposals showing 7 specific points at which Southcott's numbers were incorrect because they had been copied from her uncorrected February draft, and a final section showing the total value of the Harwick estate under current management, with a comparative table to the estate position at Lord Aldrich's death. She sat in the estate office with the door slightly open and listened to the meeting unfold. Southcott, it turned out, was not a careful liar. He had copied her numbers with the confidence of a man who believes the original source has no standing to object, and when Charles Worthing placed the annotated documents before the consortium and walked through the origin timeline, Southcott's responses had the particular stumbling quality of a man reconstructing a story he had not expected to need. Fletcher was a different case, not a liar, but a pragmatist who had allowed himself to be persuaded that an opportunity was available, and who now sat with the expression of a man recalibrating the landscape. It was at the point when Southcott attempted to argue that the uncorrected errors were not definitive evidence of copying, but merely a coincidence of calculation, that Charles Worthing said, simply, "I would like to ask Miss Ashford to present the working documents." There was a silence in the library. Eleanor heard it clearly through the open door. She stood, gathered her copies, and walked into the room. She had been in difficult rooms before. She had sat across from Hobson the creditor, and Edwin Dunmore, and Lord Aldrich on the first day with the disordered accounts, and her mother in Bristol after her father died. She understood that a room full of men who have not expected you is not a hostile room. It is simply a room that has not yet adjusted, and adjustment is a matter of information, presented clearly and documented carefully, and without apology. She set her documents on the table. She did not look at Reese, who was at the head of the table, and who had gone very still. She said, "Gentlemen, I will demonstrate the origin of the northern expansion projections." She walked through the annotated timeline. She did not argue. She did not explain herself or her presence or her history. She presented the documents page by page with the specific references, the dates, the marginal notations, and the 2 uncorrected errors. She spoke in the voice she had used for 4 years in the estate office, measured, precise, unhurried. The room changed while she was speaking. It was not a dramatic change. It was the specific, quiet change of a room in which information has shifted who has standing. Fletcher leaned forward at page 12. One of the other investors, Harwood, a wool merchant's son who knew accounts, picked up his own copy and began to read ahead. Southcott stopped talking. When she reached the final page, the comparative table of the estate position, she said, "The northern expansion projections represent 4 years of estate operational knowledge. They are sound. The Harwick estate is prepared to proceed with the consortium on this basis." She closed her annotated copy. "The alternative proposal is derived from a February draft. The figures it uses were corrected before the final version. I can provide the specific corrections if any member of the consortium wishes to review them." The room was quiet for a long moment. It was Harwood who spoke first. He said, "These annotations are in one hand throughout." Eleanor said, "Yes. These are your working documents. You produced the expansion projections." "Yes." Harwood looked at Fletcher. Fletcher was looking at the table. Southcott had developed the expression of a man who has understood that the room he is in has reorganized itself around him, and that his position in it is no longer the one he arrived with. Reese said nothing. He was looking at Eleanor with the expression she now understood completely, and he was very still. Then he stood up. He stood up at the head of the table, in the specific way of a man who has made a decision and is prepared to be witnessed making it. And he said, "I want to clarify something for this consortium. The Harwick Estates expansion proposal was produced by Miss Eleanor Ashford, who has managed this estate's accounts and operations for 4 years, and whose knowledge of the northern acreage is more detailed than any other person in this room, myself included." He paused. "Precisely. I should have made this clear at the beginning of this process. It is clear now." He looked at Eleanor. He said, "Miss Ashford, will you remain and answer the consortium's questions?" She said, "Yes, Your Grace." She sat down, and the questions began, and she answered them, and the room had changed. Edwin Dunmore was not at the consortium meeting, but he had been given the annotated documents that evening by Charles Worthing, and he came to the estate office the following morning. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Eleanor at her writing table, and his face had the expression of a man who has reviewed an account and found it does not read as he expected. He said, "The February error in the projections, you caught it yourself." "Yes. The corrected version is dated the 4th of March. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I did not look at this correctly. There was no warmth in this. There was also no contempt. It was the statement of a man revising a ledger entry, not pleased about the revision, but prepared to make it." Eleanor said, "No, but you have looked at it now." He left without further comment. She picked up her list and continued. Fletcher came to her 2 days after the consortium meeting. He stood in the estate office doorway with the expression of a man performing a considered act, and he said, "I owe you an account of myself, Miss Ashford." He had allowed himself to be drawn into Southcott's approach, he said, because the alternative proposal had appeared credible, and the question of its origin had not been asked. He was not excusing this. He was accounting for it. Eleanor listened with complete attention. She said, "I appreciate the account, Mr. Fletcher. Will you be continuing with the Harwick Consortium?" He said that he would. She said that she was glad to hear it. She shook his hand, and he went, and she returned to the expansion documents, because Southcott had withdrawn and the consortium proposal needed to be reconfigured for 5 parties instead of 6, and that was a morning's work. Lady Cecilia Vane departed Harwick on the day following the consortium meeting. She said her farewells in the entrance hall with perfect composure, pausing near Eleanor with an expression that was not entirely readable but contained something more complex than her usual certainty. She said, "You are very good at this, Miss Ashford." Eleanor said, "Thank you, Lady Cecilia." "It is not entirely a compliment," Cecilia said, "but not unkindly. Goodness at things that are invisible is a difficult sort of goodness to live with." Eleanor said, "I have found it manageable." Cecilia looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost acknowledgement. Then she stepped into her coach, and the coach departed, and Eleanor turned back to the house. She had not destroyed anything. She had simply made Cecilia Vane irrelevant, which was, she understood, the better outcome, and also the only one that was genuinely available to her. Reese found her in the garden that evening. The garden at Harwick was formal in the front, arranged hedges, gravel paths, the kind of landscape that existed to be seen from the upstairs windows. But the eastern path behind the kitchen gardens was genuinely old and somewhat ungoverned, and Eleanor sometimes walked there in the late evening when the work was done, because the light at that hour was warm and unhurried, and there was no one to perform competence for. He came along the path from the direction of the house without a coat, which was unusual for Reese, who was always precisely dressed, and he walked with the specific purpose of a man who knows where he is going and has decided to go there without further preparation. He stopped a few feet from her and said, "I have been trying to find the right words for approximately 2 years." Eleanor turned to face him. She said, "That seems like a long time." "I am told I am not quick," he said, which surprised her slightly, because it was self-directed, and Reese was not often self-directed. "You are methodical," she said. "There is a difference." He was quiet for a moment, and she looked at him in the evening light. This man she had been managing the world for, and who had been managing his way toward something she had refused, for a long time, to name. And she waited for what was coming with the attention she brought to things that mattered. He said, "The consortium proposal, the estate accounts, the 4 years." He paused. "I arranged the Wentworth reception and invited the people I invited, because I was doing what dukes are supposed to do, finding the right marriage, the right match, the expected thing." He looked at her steadily. "And then I sat in that library and watched you present 41 pages of documented evidence and speak 4 years of invisible work into visibility, and I understood that I had been performing an obligation when the actual answer had been in the estate office the entire time." Eleanor stood very still. She said, "That is not the most flattering framing." "No," he agreed, "but it is the accurate one, and I have learned from watching you that accurate is better than flattering." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "There is something I need to tell you, Reese." It was the first time she had used his name without the title, and she heard how it sounded in her own voice, and did not take it back. "In the spring of 1821, after your father died, I thought, for a brief time, that you and I understood each other in a way that was more than professional, and I decided I was wrong, and I stepped back. And I have been stepping back very consistently for 2 years." She paused. "I was the one who gave up on you, before anything was ever openly between us. I talked myself out of it before you had the opportunity to make any choice at all." The garden was very quiet. Reese said, "I know." She looked at him. "I noticed," he said. "The specific moment, in March of 1821, when you stopped staying in the estate office when I was there. I noticed, and I told myself it was sensible, because the circumstances required sensibility, and I was very good at that particular lie for a long time." He moved, 1 step, closer to her. "You did not give up on anything, Eleanor. You made a reasonable calculation based on the available information. The problem is that the available information did not include what I was actually thinking." She said, "What were you actually thinking?" He said, "That you were the most extraordinary person I had ever been in a room with, that I had been in the wrong rooms for a long time before I came home to Harwick, that every morning when I knew you were in the estate office, I had a reason to get up that was not the estate." He did not touch her. He stood at the distance appropriate to their circumstance, which was still uncertain, and he said, "I will ask you properly, with witnesses and correct form, because the situation requires it, and because you deserve the public forum as much as the private one. But I want you to know first, here, before any of the formal machinery, that the formal proposal is not the reason. The reason is that you straightened my cravat and told me it had been crooked for 40 minutes, and I have thought about nothing else since." Eleanor looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who is thinking completely before they answer. She counted 4 years of invisible work, 2 years of stepping back, the letter about Venice, the evenings in the estate office, his hands still at his sides. She said yes. He let out a breath that contained, she thought, approximately 2 years of careful containment. "Yes," he repeated, the way a man confirms an account that is finally balanced. "Yes," she said again. "But Reese, if you arrange a public proposal and I answer yes in front of your family, that is the expedient answer, and everyone will know it is the expedient answer, and I will not have it. The real answer is the one I am giving you now, in this garden, with no witnesses and no formal machinery, and I need you to understand that this answer comes first." He said, "I understand." She said, "Good. Then arrange the formal proposal. I will answer appropriately in front of whoever you choose. But this," she gestured slightly at the space between them in the evening garden, "this is the real thing." He reached out then and took her hand. Not her gloved hand. She had been carrying her gloves in her other hand since she came out to the garden, and it was her bare hand he held, and his thumb moved once across her knuckles with a care that was not performance. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "I know." The formal proposal came 3 days later, in the Harwick drawing room, with Edwin Dunmore and Charles Worthing and Margaret Soane present, and Reese asked her, with the precise language of his social world, and Eleanor said yes, with the composure of a woman who had made her decision 3 days ago in a garden, and did not find this version of it anything other than the required form. Edwin Dunmore, standing at the window, said nothing during the proposal itself. After it was done, after Charles Worthing had shaken Reese's hand, and Margaret had taken Eleanor's arm with the warmth of someone who was genuinely, unceremoniously pleased, Edwin Dunmore approached Eleanor and said quietly, "I misjudged the situation." Eleanor said, "Yes, I will not say I was entirely wrong, but I was more wrong than right." She said, "That is an honest accounting, sir." He said, "It is the most I can offer." She said, "It is enough." Mrs. Gareth, the housekeeper, was waiting in the corridor outside the drawing room, with the expression of someone who has known something was coming for longer than the principals, and found the confirmation satisfying. She took Eleanor's hand in both of hers and said, "Well done, miss. Well done." It was the simplest thing anyone had said to her in years, and Eleanor held it for a moment before she smiled, because it was genuine welcome in a house she had been keeping standing, and it was the first time the house had offered it back. They were married in November of 1822 at Harwick, in the old chapel that had not been used for a wedding in 14 years, and the guest list was an interesting document in itself, shorter than most expected, longer than some, and including at least 4 members of the Wentworth Consortium, and one former creditor named Hobson who had, when invited by way of Eleanor's dry private amusement, accepted with notable speed. Margaret Soane sat in the second row and wept freely, which she later said was entirely appropriate, and which Eleanor, who had not cried, found deeply touching. Charles Worthing stood with the expression of a man who has seen the accounts balance, and considers this the best possible outcome. Even Edwin Dunmore, seated near the back, wore the expression of someone who is adjusting to a conclusion he had not projected but finds, on balance, better than the alternative. The first year of their marriage produced the organized consolidation of everything Eleanor had been doing without credit. Reese had a document drawn up. Charles Worthing drafted it, with Eleanor's input on the specific clauses, which meant she essentially wrote her own professional acknowledgement, which she found both useful and somewhat absurd, formalizing her role as a state administrator for the Harwick properties, at a salary that reflected not what women in household positions typically received, but what the work she was doing was actually worth. This was not sentiment, it was the accurate account. She also, in that first year, produced the annotated expansion documents in a revised and cleaned form, and sent copies to 3 neighboring estates whose stewards had written to Harwick with questions about the northern development. The letters came back with requests for additional guidance. By the spring of 1823, she was corresponding with 7 estates. By the autumn, she had been asked, twice, to come in person to review accounts. Reese had said, The first time one of these letters arrived, "You are going to build something." She had said, "I am going to continue what I have already been doing, with my name on it." He had looked at her with the expression she no longer needed to work to read, warm, measuring, proud in the specific way of a man watching someone who is exactly what they are, and he had said, "Fair enough." Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1824, which was both inconvenient in timing, relative to the wool contract review, and the most precisely timed thing that had ever happened to Eleanor, and they named her Louisa, after Rhys's mother, because Rhys had wanted this quietly for a long time, and Eleanor had seen it in the set of his face when they stood in the old music room and she had played, haltingly, the composition she had found in a drawer of the old piano, a composition she later discovered had been his mother's. She had not told him what it was when she played it. She had simply played it, carefully, and watched his face change from the corner of her eye, and understood, from the way he was very still, that the music had unlocked something he had been keeping carefully closed, and she had played it to the end, and then sat quietly, and he had come to stand beside the piano and placed one hand on the lid of it and said nothing for a long time, and she had left the question alone, because some things do not require naming. Louisa arrived with her father's dark hair and her mother's assessing eyes, and an immediate and comprehensive interest in anything that was not where it was supposed to be, which Eleanor recognized as a family trait, and found, to her mild surprise, entirely charming. By the time Louisa was 3 months old, she had learned that the woman who held her had a specific sound. Pen on paper, the measured shift of a ledger page, that meant peace, and she slept best in the estate office, in the basket beside the writing table, to the sound of her mother working. The estate office at Harwick came to be known, among the 7 neighboring estates Eleanor corresponded with and the 2 she visited annually, as the source of the most reliable expansion methodology in the west of England. The annotated documents she had produced were copied and distributed without her name on them, in the early years, and with her name on them after 1825, when Rhys had quietly and without drama begun appending her name to everything that went out from Harwick, and no one who received documents from the Harwick estate objected, because the documents were too useful to object to. Eleanor Ashford Dunmore was not celebrated for this. She was not given a civic honor or a formal acknowledgement. What she had was a room that had been hers for years, now with her name on the door, and a body of work that was making itself felt in the management of real land and real accounts in ways that would outlast her, and a daughter who at 18 months had begun to climb toward her mother's writing table with the specific purposefulness of a small person who has identified something interesting. On an evening in October of 1825, with the Harwick accounts current and the expansion fully operational, Eleanor sat at her writing table with Louisa, asleep in the basket, and the lamp casting its familiar light on the annotated ledger, open before her. She was reviewing the final tenant yield figures for the 3rd quarter, which were slightly above projection, which meant she had been right about the southeastern drainage adjustment she had proposed 2 years ago, and which the contractor had completed in April. She heard footsteps in the corridor, the familiar sound of Rhys's particular stride, and then a pause outside the door, in the way he sometimes paused before coming in, the habit, she now understood, that had begun before they were married, the habit of standing outside a door in which she was working, and simply being near the sound of it. He came in. He looked at Louisa asleep in the basket, and then at Eleanor at her writing table, with the expression he wore in the private hours of the house, not the Duke's expression, not the measured public face, but the particular warmth of a man who has come home to a room where the people he most needs are already there. He said, "How are the tenant figures?" She said, "The southeastern drainage worked. I was right." He said, "You were right 4 years before you were right. That is different from being right." She looked up at him, and he was looking back at her with the unhurried attention of someone who has learned, the long way, to see what is there. And she felt, in the warm, ordinary light of the estate office, with Louisa asleep and the accounts balanced and the lamp burning steadily, the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of a life that had been built carefully and was holding. She returned to her ledger. He sat down in the chair beside her writing table and opened his own correspondence. Because the hour was early still, and they had long since established the habit of working in the same room in the evenings, side by side, each attending to their own page, and it was, Eleanor had decided some time ago, exactly what she had been hoping for without knowing the name of it. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work, and it had been enough. And then it had been more than enough, and now it was hers.